welcome everyone. This is Prophet in the Court of the King, part of Drisha's Summer Kollel offerings with Rabbi David Silber. In this class, we will look at how the relationship between king and court prophet can be fraught, and we will explore the tensions and complexities of this connection through a study of the prophet in the book of Shmuel and Kings. Sources for today's class are coming from just today for Shmuel Aleph. If you have a Tanakh that you prefer to use, you're welcome to keep it at hand. And I will also share sources on screen from Sefaria. It's always a pleasure to have Rabbi Silber teaching here. He is the dean and founder of Drisha. And with that, I am going to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Yes, our topic is the prophet in the court of the king. And in our study, we'll be focusing on two prophets. The focus will be the book of Shmuel. That's the main focus. And the book of Shmuel, depending how you see where it ends, either it ends with the last chapter of Shmuel Bet, or point to some, the book actually continues for the first two chapters of Sefer Malachim, where King David turns the kingship over to his son Shlomo, gives his instructions, etc. Shlomo gets rid of potential adversaries, and the kingship is established. David's kingship is established through his son Shlomo. That'll be that's the text that we'll be looking at. Obviously, we meet three times, and there's the book is very complex, and it's a great piece of art. But we'll take a look, and the focus will be two prophets that appear in the book of Shmuel. The first one is Shmuel himself, who was one of the central characters in the book. And the second prophet is the prophet Nathan. He appears in two very critical places. One is in the aftermath of the David Bathsheba story. Actually, he appears in three places. He appears when David suggests that he build the temple, the Beit HaMikdash. He appears in the David Bathsheba episode. And he appears in the beginning of Sefer Malachim when the question of David's successor was unclear, and the prophet Natan, together with Bathsheba, work out a plan to convince King David to choose Solomon, his son Shlomo, as his successor. He appears three times. We'll spend one session focusing on Natan, and the first two sessions focusing on Shmuel. Obviously, Shmuel is a major character. We could spend a lot more time, but the focus will be the relationship of king and prophet as manifest in the character of Shmuel in the book of Shmuel. Just to begin, I'll stop periodically for comments or questions. And again, if you have questions in the chat, you can just post them to Kayla and we'll see if I can deal with it. The book of Shmuel, in general, the theme of the entire book is kingship. Previous book ended with the motif of, in those days, there was no king. People did whatever they wanted. That's the conclusion of the previous book in our canon, Shoftim. And the book of Shmuel is a call for kingship. And what's interesting, the book begins with the well-known story of Chana. The very first chapter, there's a man, says the book, from Har Ephraim named Elkanah. He has two wives. One is named Penina and the other is Chana. It's the very beginning of Sefer Shmuel. Penina has children, Chana has none. And we're told at the beginning of the book, the man would go up periodically to bow down and to sacrifice to the God of hosts, Hashem Tzvaot b'Shilo. Shiloh being the place of the central place of worship. It's the precursor to Jerusalem, which becomes the central place. And Shiloh at this point is the central place of worship. Shiloh appeared at the end of the previous book, where the tribe of Benjamin was instructed to kidnap the dancing women during the festivities at Shiloh. So here we again encounter Shiloh, and the text says, "V'sham shnei b'nei Eli, Chofni u'Finchas kohanim Hashem." That Shiloh is governed by the two sons of Eli, Chofni and Pinchas, priests unto God. That's how the book of Shmuel begins. We discover in chapter 2 that Hophni and Pinchas are no good. The text describes them as B'nai Belial, whatever that means specifically, it's certainly negative. Wayward children, scoundrels, here the translation is scoundrels, and that the book of Shmuel, not getting into it, describes how this manifested. Essentially, they take the first portions of the sacrifice for themselves, sort of ripping off God. They also take from the people, the sacrifices by force from the people, ripping off the people, and on top of all that, they seem to misbehave with the women who come to bring sacrifices in Shiloh. In short, they're no good. The text says that God hates them, and God is determined to destroy Shiloh. That's what it says. God sends a prophet to their father, who is Eli, who figures in chapter 1, a high priest, and to says to him, listen, your institution is essentially rotten to the core. You've done nothing to correct your children, and I'm going to have to destroy Shiloh. This anonymous prophet who appears in the second chapter says this to Eli. Fine. Coming back now to our story, so we had told about Elkanah's two wives, Hannah and Penina. Hannah has no children. Elkanah goes periodically to Shiloh to bow down and sacrifice. And when he would go up to Shiloh, that's how the book begins, he favored Hannah. He loved Hannah, maybe also had sympathy for her plight. And he would give Hannah, from the sacrificial portions, he would give her more than the other wife who had children. And the other wife resented it. And she would taunt Hannah, and she would oppress Hannah. And Hannah would cry and be too upset that she couldn't eat. He gives her more portions to eat, but she ends up eating nothing. And we are told at the beginning of the book, he did this every time he went up. So every time he goes up, there's the same routine. He goes up there, he favors her with the effect of causing her a lot of distress. That's how the book of Shmuel begins. It's the Haftorah of Rosh Hashanah, actually. And so finally, he tries to console her. Says, listen, what are you crying about? I'm better than 10 children, he says. But she doesn't accept that. And we're told that Hannah, in the very first chapter, in the 10th pasuk, he morat nefesh. She was very bitter. She prayed to God and she cried. And in the 11th verse of chapter 1, we're told what her prayer is. It's actually a very interesting prayer, and for Chazal, it becomes one of the most significant prayers. It's a prayer that she says quietly, Tefillah B'lachash, which becomes the model for our Shemona Esrei. The core prayer of the Jewish people is related to Hannah's prayer. It says, Vatidor neder, she took a vow. Vatomar, Hashem Tzvaot, Imra'ot tireh b'ani amotecha, u'schartani v'otishkach ad amotecha. Notato l'amotcha zera anashim, u'le'tativ l'Hashem kol yimei chayav, u'moro lo yaleh al rosho. One verse is a prayer, which is a vow. She takes a vow. And she says, God, Hashem Tzvaot, if you will see the suffering of your servant, Amotecha, the female servant, remember me. Don't forget your servant. Give your servant children. I will give this child to you all the days of his life, and no razor shall ever touch his head. That's the prayer of Hannah. It's one verse, and it's a vow. It's interesting that it's a vow. So what is the vow? She makes a commitment that if you give me a child, I will dedicate the child to God. It's actually, when you think about it, very strange. If you give me a child, you give the child away. But for our purposes, what's interesting is, what does it mean? Umara lo yaleh al rosho. No razor shall touch his head. In other words, he's not going to cut his hair. Well, what does that suggest to us? That she says that her child, if given a child, will be dedicated to God, and he won't cut his hair. So not cutting his hair reminds us, no doubt, of the description in the Torah of the Nazir. In fact, not just the Torah, the story of Shimshon, Samson. He's a Nazir. He's one who separates from the community, is dedicated to God. And one of the restrictions of the Nazir, the commitment of the Nazir, is reflected in the fact that he never cuts his hair. So what is the idea? So her son, if you give me a child, he's going to be a kind of Nazir. It's a Nazirite figure. The word Nazir means separate. That's Hannah's prayer in chapter 1. Then you have Hannah's prayer in chapter 2. The prayer in chapter 2 was after her son Shmuel was born. And then was another prayer. First 10 verses of chapter 2, we have Tfilat Hannah. Here it's called the Tfilah prayer. Vatitparel Hannah v'tomar olas libi b'Hashem, etc. I'm not going to read the whole 10 verses, but just to make 2 points about Hannah's prayer after Samuel was born. And that is that, first of all, when you read Hannah's prayer in chapter 2, remember as a kid we had to memorize it. When you read the prayer, you say to yourself, what is the relevance of this prayer to the fact that you just had a child? There seems to be no relevance whatsoever. There is one line over there in the 10 verses that says that that God gives children to the one who formerly had no children. The Akara Yoda, right? Ad Akara Yoda Shiva in verse number 3. But outside of that, the prayer seems to have nothing to do with having a child altogether. The theme of Hannah's prayer is about God. How God, she says, raises up the righteous or the poor or the meek, and God will punish the haughty, the powerful, and the wicked, such as in verse number 9, Raglei Chasidav Yishmar U'Rishaim B'Choshech Yidamu K'lo B'Koach Yidbarish. Hashem Morishu Ma'ashir. God makes poor and God makes rich. Mashpio Af Meromein. What does that have to do with having a child? And the answer is nothing. It has absolutely nothing to do with having a child. It's about the way God, in Hannah's view, wishes to govern the world. It's the world that God, if God had God's way, this is what God would want. And the last verse number 10, our final verse is, Hashem yechatum rivav alav mishamayim yarein. The foes of God will be shattered. God will thunder against them in the heavens. Hashem yadin afsei aretz. God will judge the ends of the earth. V'yitain oz l'malko, and give strength to God's king. V'yarem keren mishicho, and triumph to his anointed one. So this poem of Hannah, in the beginning of the book of Shmuel, which is the book about kingship, in the very beginning of the book, we have a prayer for kingship. There is no kingship yet. But the last verse of Hannah's prayer, which describes the way God wishes to govern the world, the idea of divine justice, equity, compassion for the weak, etc. And the last verse, the song ends. God will give strength to God's king and raise up God's anointed one. So in short, Tfilat Hannah, the beginning of the book of Shmuel, is a prayer for kingship. And kingship for Hannah means somebody who reflects God's values. And Hannah believes, obviously, that such a thing is possible. You can actually have a king who reflects God's values. That's Hannah's thinking. That's the prayer in chapter 2. Now the question is, the prayer in chapter 1 is a request for a child. Question, is the child she is requesting, is that going to be the king? She has 2 prayers. One is, give me a child. And the second is, God, we need a king who can recognize your value system and kind of bring your values to earth. Have a society that reflects your true values. Those 2 prayers, what is the relationship between these 2 prayers? So, just wanted to say that I don't think that she thinks that her son's going to be the king, because she presents her son as a kind of Nazir. No razor shall touch his head. what is the relationship between the Nazir and the king? And what is there a relationship between the Nazir and the king? Well, I'll tell you what I think the relationship is. They're actually opposites. The king is the establishment. The king represents the people. The Nazir, and the very word Nazir suggests separation. The Nazir separates from the people. The king's all about continuity. To establish kingship, you need continuity. The Nazir is one who has no family. He doesn't even, he or could be a he or she doesn't even go to his parents' funeral. Not allowed to become ritually impure to anybody, just like the high priest. Cannot come in contact with any corpse, any dead. And has no past, as it were, and has no future. He's completely and utterly separate. The ultimate Nazir, the main Nazir of the Bible, is Shimshon. He's completely separate. He's in no real sense the part of the Jewish people. He doesn't live amongst them. He doesn't marry them. He doesn't live amongst them. On the contrary, at one point they even try to hand him over to the Philistines. So it's not that Hannah wants her son to be a king. What she wants is a different kind of society, and she may see her son as instrumental in creating that new society, but the governance of the society will not be in the hands of the Nazir. Ultimately, what she prays for is kingship. That's a very important point, and that's how the book begins. And that's when we start the book with Hannah and Hannah's prayer. Now, the other point of it is that in the request for kingship, or a world in which God's values can be realized, what she is implicitly suggesting when she walks into Shiloh is that the current society in no way reflects God's values. And that is certainly the case, given the fact that the present governing body of the Jewish people in the book of Shmuel, in chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3, are the priests. The priests govern the country. The high priest is Eli, he's old, and his two sons are running the show, Chafni and Pinchas. And Hannah walks in, and she sees immediately, unlike her husband, that this is a place that in no way reflects God's values. It's the opposite. It's taking advantage of the people, it's usurping their role, God's place, etc., etc. Hannah understands this. Hannah sees this. And here we come to another basic theme of the book of Shmuel in general, which is a very important point, and that is the ability of people to actually see. And this plays out, and we'll get to this in the third session, but it plays out, and it's relevant to kingship. What actually precludes people from seeing? What precludes people from seeing is they have some kind of interest. They're vested in something. And when you're vested, you can't actually see. So if you're a king, what many kings want, pretty high up on their list, is they want to make sure that they remain king, or that their dynasty will exist. So they think about in terms of themselves. They want to keep things, they don't want to upset the apple cart, as it were. If you don't want to upset the apple cart, then you won't actually be able to see. That's one of the basic themes of the book. But the person who sees is somebody who's not vested. So in the beginning of the book, there's one person who's not at all vested. And her name is Hannah, a childless woman. She's totally on the outside. Because she's on the outside, she sees what is obvious to every reader, but not obvious to any participant, which is the place of Shiloh was totally and utterly corrupt. That's how our book begins. So it's a prayer for her son. She describes him as a kind of Nazir. And it's also a prayer for kingship. And this sets the stage for what is the basic question in the book of Shmuel. And I would frame it this way. Hannah wants a king. She makes that clear. Her son will be the great kingmaker. In the book of Samuel, the person who will appoint the first two kings of Israel. The first king of Israel is King Saul, and the second king of Israel, whose kingship endures, is King David. They're both anointed by Samuel the prophet. So he's the kingmaker. But of course, when you study the book of Shmuel, what you recognize immediately is that the great kingmaker is the person most opposed to kingship. He's against kingship. He argues with the people not to choose a king, and we'll come to that in a couple of minutes. So herein lies an interesting feature of the book. The book is very complicated. Hannah prays for a king, and her son will be instrumental in kingship, in creating the kingship, but he's dead set against it. He's against it. She's in favor of it. Where does the book stand? Where does God stand? That's an interesting question. Now, before we get to this question of the king, Samuel in the court of the king, we have to go back again to Hannah's prayer and what Hannah is actually praying for in chapter 1. This is chapter 1 in verse number 11. Our whole prayer consists of one puzzle, basically. What does she say? She says that first of all, she takes a vow. It's a very important point about prayer. There's a connection between a neder and a prayer, which suggests to us something about prayer. What is prayer about, actually? Prayer is about making commitments. That's what it comes down to. Prayer is about making commitments. And that's the connection between the neder and the prayer. A neder means I take a vow, I'm going to do something. That's what tefillah is. Of course, we make commitments, but we ask God to help us to achieve our goals. In order to achieve our goals, we may need good health. We may need some kind of resources. We may need a society in which I can walk outside without fear someone's going to take a shot at me. We ask for insight. But at the end of the day, it's about the commitments. That's Hannah's prayer. So Hannah says, listen, if you give me a child, I make a commitment. This child of mine is going to be special and different. It's going to be in your service. That's the idea of the Nazir. The child will be in your service. Let's take a look at her prayer. It's one verse. Vatidor neder vatomar Hashem tzvaot imraot tireh bo'ani amotecha u'zachartani v'lo tishkach et amotecha v'natato amatcha zera anashim u'netati v'Hashem kol yemei chayav u'maro lo yareh al roshav. What do we notice about this verse? Let's first, the obvious point is that one word appears 3 times. Amatecha, your servant. So the one entering into prayer sees oneself as God's servant. I am dependent upon God. I need your help. I want to do something. Please help me accomplish my goals. 3 times she refers to herself as Amatecha, as your servant. But there's something else very interesting about prayer. I know that's not our main topic here, but nonetheless, and that is that this pasuk recalls another verse. The way the biblical narrative works in general is one text recalls another. It recalls it primarily or initially through common language. And once you see the common language, you begin to recognize that there are all kinds of connections. Imra'o tireh bo'ani amotecha. I want you to see ra'o tireh, she emphasizes, please see ani amotecha. The suffering of your maidservants. Where do we have a parallel verse to that? Imra'o tireh bo'ani amotecha. Does anybody know where we have a parallel verse? A rather important parallel verse that appears in a very strategic place, as does the verse over here. The verse appears in the first chapter of the book.
In Shemot.
It is in Shemot. And where in Shemot is it?
When God says he sees the affliction of Bnei Israel and he's going to do something about it.
Right, story of the burning bush. When God first talks to Moshe, God wants to take the Jews out of Egypt. And God says to Moshe, after the preliminaries, take off your shoes, and I'm going to tell you who I am.
Ra'iti.
That's how God starts. I have seen the suffering of my people. And God says to Moshe, I've seen the suffering of my people, and I intend to take them out. And you're going to help me do this. You're going to pull them out of Egypt. His name is Moshe, the one who draws out. And what and to what end? What is the purpose of leaving Egypt? So there are actually two purposes that God spells out in that chapter 3 of Sefer Shemot, in the burning bush. And God says to Moshe that you're going to take the people out of Egypt, and someday you're going to bring them back to this mountain, which is Har Sinai, and you're going to bring them into the land of milk and honey. You're going to take them out and bring them into the land of milk and honey. But before you get to the land of milk and honey, there's a stop along the way, which is this very place where we're talking, which is Mount Sinai. And on this mountain, you will serve God. Tavdu neto Elohim ala har hazeh. Now the question is, what does that mean, you will serve God on this mountain? How will you serve God on the mountain? What happens then? What are the necessary prerequisites to entering the land? And there are two in the book of Exodus. One is to receive the Torah. That's the blueprint for our for behavior. It's the way of behaving. If you behave this way, you can become a holy nation, a holy people. That's one thing. Then something else happens at Sinai, not on top of the mountain, but at Sinai, at this very place. And that is that the people together, right after the receiving the Torah, they will build the Mishkan. They'll build the Mishkan. They'll build the temple, and that's how the book of Exodus ends. The book of Exodus ends with building the temple. And now where's Chana standing when she prays? The husband's bringing sacrifices. Where's Chana? She's inside Shiloh. What is Shiloh? What's another word for Shiloh? The Mishkan. She's standing in that Mishkan. She's standing in the Mishkan. And what is she saying to God? Listen, God, if Imra'ot tireh bani amatecha. Listen, she says, I would say this way. You spoke to Moshe at the burning bush, and you instructed Moshe, take the people out of Egypt and receive and teach them how to live and build a temple. And I'm standing inside your temple. And let me tell you something. It's not working. I mean, you get an A for effort. But frankly, God, it's not really working. So I'll tell you what. Do me a favor. Why don't you hand that job over to me? And give me an opportunity. If you give me an opportunity, I'll build you a real Mishkan. A Mishkan, not where people bring sacrifices necessarily, but a Mishkan where one can encounter God. And the text plays with that. Imra'ot tireh, v'nir'ad panei Hashem. She says, I'll give my child. It's what we have at the Akedah. The place is called Hashem Yireh. Hashem Yamir Hayom Bahar Hashem Yireh. Now, in order to do this, in order to build a correct Mishkan. By the way, how does the book of Samuel end? What's the last chapter of the book of Samuel? The last chapter is the story of David's taking the census, and he sees the angel hovering above Goren Aravna, last chapter, and this will become the place of the Beit HaMikdash. So Chana's vision is actually realized in the book of Shmuel. That's what Chana is saying. So in order to do this, what do we need? What do I need, says Chana, in order to do it right this time? I mean, you made a good attempt, God, but obviously it's not working. I'm standing in a place of utter corruption, which you yourself hate. You're going to destroy it. So we got to do better this time. So I'll tell you what, you help me out and I'll do better. So what is she requesting then? She requests a child. Who is this child going to be? Answer. the child is going to be a second Moses. Shmuel is going to be a second Moses. That's what she's hoping for. And in point of fact, and we're not studying the book of Shmuel now, but in point of fact, the character of Shmuel is actually based on Moshe. There are all kinds of connections to Moshe, parallels between Moshe and Shmuel. And one of them, by the way, is in this week's Haftorah, Parshas Korach. You look at the Parshas Korach Haftorah, which is taken from chapter 12 of Shmuel Aleph, you will see for yourselves that it's actually based on the story of Moshe in Parshat Korach, in his interaction with Korach, etc. Datan and Aviram. Without getting to the details of it, you study the book of Shmuel, you'll see for yourselves there are all kinds of connections between Moshe and Shmuel. And that's not to say they're the same, but they're in the same camp. They're similar and they're different in many ways. And that's an interesting study. But the point is, what she's asking for is a Moshe. So it's true. She puts it in terms of being a Nazir. But she's asking for a second Navi, actually. She's asking for another Moses. Give me a Moses and we'll build the right kind of temple. That's what she's suggesting. Now Moshe took Israel out of Egypt. But Hannah, in the hands of the book of Samuel, wants her son to take Israel out of Egypt, not geographical Egypt, but Egypt from the standpoint of values. The way the book of Shmuel presents the situation of Bnei Yisrael at this point in time, and the priesthood, they're living in Egypt. So you have to take them out of the conceptual Egypt. And that's the story of chapter 3. In chapter 3, where Samuel becomes Samuel the prophet in chapter 3. And in chapter 3, we're told the following. It says, Shmuel, Misharetet Hashem B'fnei Eli. Chapter 3, verse 1. Samuel served God before Eli. In other words, Hannah hands Samuel, her son Shmuel, to the high priest Eli. And he serves God under Eli is his Rabbi. Eli is his Rabbi. And Samuel is serving God. Eli's own children are utterly corrupt, but Shmuel is not corrupt at all. Shmuel is the son maybe he had wished for, he had hoped for. And we're told the following story, without getting into all the details, just a couple of verses. Vahi bayomahu, one second. Zvar Hashem yakar bayamim mahem ein chazon. In those days, God's voice was rare, precious. Yakar is precious, means rare, right? Something is rare, it's more precious. God's voice was precious. Ein chazon nifrat. Vision was scarce. Vahi bayomahu, v'eli shochei bimkomo. At that time, Eli was sleeping in his own place. He's within the temple precincts. He has his own room. His eyes had become too dim. He could not see. Verse number 3. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. And Samuel was sleeping in the temple, where the ark of God was found. Those are the first 3 verses of chapter 3. And what is common to all 3 verses? What do you see in all 3 verses? Verse 1, verse 2, and verse 3. The dimming of the lights. The dimming of the lights. Vision is not widespread. In chazon nifratz. In verse 2, and in verse 3, the lamp of God was not yet extinguished. There's some light, but it's very dim. There's a tiny light. What does that recall, of course? What story is about the tiny light? Tiny light. Of course, that's the story of the burning bush. There's a little fire there. There's a little light, very small light. A little bush is burning. The fire is not consumed. The fire doesn't go out. And God speaks to Moshe. Moshe, Vayomer Hineni. That's the burning bush. And over here in verse 4, Vayikra Hashem el Shmuel Vayomer Hineni. In other words, it's parallel to the Moshe story, as I already suggested. What Hannah wants is a second Moses. And the point over here about the lights, well, what is the idea of the dimming of the lights? There's a little bit of light. The burning bush, there's a little light. What does that mean? It means that for 200 years, God hasn't spoken. The last time God speaks is when Jacob goes down to Egypt. And suddenly God begins to speak to Moshe. Suddenly God has someone to speak to. And God calls Moshe, and God calls again, and God speaks with Moshe, and this whole dialogue, Moshe refuses to go. There's another whole long conversation. And we have the parallel, I can't get into it now, in chapter 3. But here, I want to make one point about chapter 3. And that is that when Shmuel hears God's voice in chapter 3, I mean, anybody who hasn't studied the book of Shmuel should study the book of Shmuel. It's one of the great books of the Bible, maybe one of the great books of Western civilization. And God calls to Samuel 3 times. Each time God calls to Shmuel in chapter 3, he runs off to Eli, his Rabbi. He says, "Here I am, for you have called me." And Eli says, "No, I haven't called you. Go back to sleep. Go back to your..." And he hears the voice a second time, and he goes a second time, "Here I am, for you have called me." "No," says Eli, "I haven't called you. Go back to sleep." And the third time, and Eli realizes that God is calling the child. And Eli says, "Go back. And when you hear the voice again, say, 'I am listening. Please tell me what you want.'" And what God speaks to Shmuel, what God says to Shmuel is, God confirms the prophecy of the anonymous prophet of chapter 2, and that is, "I'm going to destroy the house of Eli." That's the prophecy. Next morning, Samuel gets up, opens the door of the temple. Eli says to Samuel, "What did God say to you?" But Shmuel's afraid to speak. He doesn't want to tell him what God said. And Eli says, I impose upon you an oath. You can't hide it from me. Tell me what God said." And Samuel tells him what God had said. And Eli says, "It's the word of God. I accept it." And what is the point of that story? And that's relevant to our topic, actually. What is the point of that story? The point of the story is a very simple point. Eli, first of all, you see the complexity of the characters. Eli is Samuel's Rebbe. To the extent that when Samuel hears God's voice, he thinks it's Eli's voice. It's his Rebbe. He doesn't distinguish those two things. The voice of God and the voice of Eli for little Samuel are one voice. Those who had a real Rebbe, you can understand it. You don't distinguish. And to his shock, it's not so. In fact, God says, "I'm going to destroy Eli's house." But the interesting part of the story is, and that's part of the complexity, which is that actually what Eli is doing in that chapter is he's training Samuel to be a prophet. Because he says two things to Samuel. First of all, let me tell you how to receive God's word. You have to be ready to receive God's word. So therefore, next time you hear this, it's probably God speaking to you, and just say, "Yes, I'm open to what you have to say." That's number one. And number two, whatever God tells you, you have to say. Don't be concerned about how it might affect anybody. You have to speak the truth. That's what it means to be a prophet. And the power of the book is that actually, even as Eli is an ineffective administrator. But the point is, he's actually Samuel's Rebbe. He's teaching Samuel what it means to be a prophet. And even though he may suspect, and if he doesn't suspect, we know that the very prophecy itself is the fact that God will completely obliterate Eli and undermine Eli's dynasty and destroy Eli's dynasty. And then, that's how the book begins, a search for a governance that will run the nation. Because up to now, it's Eli and his sons and the priesthood that is governing the nation. But in the absence of Shiloh, which is destroyed in the next chapter, the question becomes, who's going to run the show? Who's going to govern this? Who's going to govern this nation? And it sets up, of course, the core question of the book: who will govern the nation? And here we have something very interesting. The book is called the Book of Samuel, Sefer Shmuel. The Gemara even suggests who wrote the book. The Gemara says Shmuel wrote the Book of Shmuel. Of course, Shmuel cannot have written the Book of Shmuel given the fact that he dies in chapter 25 in a book that has either 55 or 57 chapters. So whatever the Gemara meant by that, it can't possibly mean that he wrote the book. If there's other evidence, the book is written much later in any event. That's not our problem now. But in this book of Shmuel, there's only one chapter in which Shmuel actually runs the country. Shmuel is in charge in chapter 7. That's it, one chapter. By the time you get to chapter 8, he runs it as a prophet and as a teacher, very much in the mold of Moshe. But in chapter 8, Vahi kasher zaken Shmuel, vayasem et banav shoftim Yisrael, so he's old. He appoints his two sons. He appoints them as judges in Israel. And the text tells us, Lo chalchu banav b'darko, vayatu achrei habetza, vayichu shochad, vayatu mishpat, chapter 8, verse number 3. They are utterly corrupt. They take bribes. They pervert justice. They are totally irresponsible when it comes to governance, or worse. And then the people gather together in this critical chapter 8, and they say to Shmuel, you are old, and your sons have not followed in your path, which is all true. The text attests to that very point. Give us a king who will judge us like all the nations. That's the request. This is the critical request for the book. We want to have a king. Now, just to reflect on this for a moment, and that is that the people are the people rejecting Samuel. And the answer is they're not rejecting Samuel. In other words, the point is, what they say to Shmuel is, you are old. They have no desire to replace Shmuel until he gets too old to do the job. But you're too old to do the job, and your sons don't follow your path. So we have to go in a different direction. Give us a king like all the other nations. Now, the important point here is they ask Shmuel to give them the king. They don't go behind his back. They say, hey, Shmuel, our leader, we're going to hand this over to you. We want you to be central in choosing the king. So again, it's not a rejection of Samuel. But there is something else in this verse that's very important for our purposes, and that is that what is the problem what is the problem that they raise? The problem they're raising here is that you're great. You're Shmuel Hanavi. We totally respect you, but your sons are no good. Give us a king like all the other nations. I suggest means give us a king like the other nations have, because the idea of the kingship is that it's passed down from one generation to the next. In other words, the request for kingship is a function of a lack of stability. What the people want is a stable government. And they're saying to Samuel, you are a great prophet and a great leader, but your sons are not prophets. Not only they're not prophets, they're also corrupt. But the point is, they're not continuing your path. But if you give us a king, we're going to solve the problem of stability. There'll be a king, and the next generation, probably his son or his oldest son, will take over, and there'll be stability. Of course, one could ask the question, what guarantee is there that the son of a king is going to be a good king? Okay, Samuel is righteous, and his children are not righteous. Well, the same thing could be true of a king. You can choose a king, and the king's children will be no good. And in point of fact, we studied the book of Malachim, that was often the case, that the king was pretty good, but the next generation were quite bad. So what is to be gained by kingship? That's a central question. Good question, but the answer is actually fairly obvious, and that's part of the problem. What the people are saying is, listen, if you're going to look for leadership towards a spiritual person, a Navi, there is no guarantee that the son of a Navi is going to be a Navi. Usually it doesn't work that way. We're hard-pressed to find too many examples, or any examples, in the plain reading of the Bible, well, the son of the prophet is also a prophet. So every generation, if your leader is a great spiritual person, it's going to be a job search every generation. But kingship is different, because you can be a bad prophet's not really a prophet, but a bad king is a king. And that's marked, among other things, by the fact that the king has certain clothing that the king wears. The clothing makes the king. The clothing makes the priest. But the clothing doesn't make the prophets. The people are willing to trade in spirituality for stability. And that's part, I think, of what bothers Shmuel. That's not all that bothers Shmuel. I want to just, at the time that we have now, first, let me stop here for a moment and take any comments or questions. And then I'll just complete with the main point I wanted to make about, and this will set us up for the next session, about what bothers Samuel about the request for kingship. But before I do that, does anybody have comments or questions?
Yes, just a comment, I'll highlight a comment from chat from Shayna Hecht. She notes that in Tehillim 99, it does mention Moshe and Aaron and Shmuel together.
Yes, it does. It mentions more than once in the prophet. Yes, of course, we say this in our Kabbalat Shabbat prayers. Moshe v'Aaron b'choanav u'Shmuel b'karei Shabbat. There's also, I think, another verse, at least one other verse, that ties Shmuel together with Moshe. We'll talk about this. By the way, I'm not suggesting that the character of Shmuel and Moshe are actually identical, far from it, and that actually the book of Shmuel, what makes the book very interesting is contains a very strong critique of Shmuel, very strong critique of Shmuel. But that's, I'll see how far we can go with this. But yes, that is true. There is that verse in we say Kabbalat Shabbat. It's one of the it's Psalm 99. That's true. What else? Anybody else?
Rabbi Silber,
Yeah.
in her prayer, excuse me, in her prayer, she says more words than are necessary. So you remember me and you don't forget me, and then it adds another word, another clause. Is there
Right.
a reason for that, or it's just her humbleness? Or
Right. Right. Let me just, you reminded me now, but I wanted to say it. I didn't say it. Something about prayer. There's something very interesting about prayer in general. This is not our topic, but I'll say it anyway, which is that prayer is a combination of two things very often. One is a sense of real humility, of recognition, standing before the infinite God, the immortal, and we're just little insignificant beings. That's one sense one has and one stands in prayer. But what's interesting is it often comes with something else, which I would call chutzpah. In other words, I am nobody, I am nobody, I am nobody. But God, you sort of messed things up the first time. Hand it over to me, and I'll do a better job. It's like when Abraham says to God when he prays for Sodom, "Who am I to talk to you? I'm just dust and ashes and an offer of an afer." Maybe they're 40 righteous. You wouldn't kill him if it's a 40. You're not going to kill him. But what about 30? What about 20? What about 10? He's negotiating, right? He's handling with God. He intersperses it all the time. Who am I to say this? I know it's who am I? But he does say it. And in prayer, you have those two elements which are interesting. One is amotecha, amotecha. What am I? I'm nothing. I'm your servant. And on the other hand, what is my request? Do me a favor. Give me a second. Give me a child. I'll turn him into a second Moses, and this time we'll get it right. So there's that interesting about prayer. Actually, these two aspects to prayer, which are interesting. Anyway, what's your point about the Amatecha? That was the point I wanted to make about Amatecha. Yes.
It's not about Amatecha, but if you remember me and you don't forget me, I mean, that's right. Excessive. And there's another phrase which I don't recall before she gets to her request, her point.
Right.
Any reason for that, or it's just the way one's mind works when one is in the middle?
I think that's right. It's an emphasis on the idea of God remembering comes often with prayer. God remembers. But there's also something else about this, which I think is very important, which is that there are certain people in society that are sort of forgotten. The people, we tend to forget or not take into account certain people on the lower end of society very often, people that are marginal, people that don't fit in, people that are different. And that when Chanes turns to God and says, but God, but you actually see everybody. you actually remember everybody, right? You live Zichronot on Rosh Hashanah. The Yom HaZikaron is Rosh Hashanah, right? God sees everybody. God doesn't forget anybody. Everybody's included. It's one way or the other. So maybe that's part of what she's saying also. Is the story of Chana, the Haftorah of Chana is Haftorah for Rosh Hashanah, actually. So the Chazal saw this Chana story and the idea of God's judgment and the way God governs the world, etc., as very much connected to Chana's prayer, but that's a whole other conversation. I did want to get to one last point, which is a critical point, which is Shmuel's opposition to kingship, which appears in chapter 8. Shmuel is angry. Now, let's just take a look at this. Shmuel is very angry when the people said, give us a king. Where's that verse? So the request for kingship is found in verse number 4, right? And verse number 5, Vayera, or verse number 6 it is, Vayera hadavar b'yeinei Shmuel, kasher amru, tno lanu melech l'shavteinu, vayitparel Shmuel el Hashem. Here there's something very interesting. It says Samuel it was evil in Samuel's eyes when the people said, give us a king to judge us, and Samuel prays to God, turns to God. What's interesting is, there's this interesting variation in the text, which is, when you read the people's request, you could raise a question, which is already implicit in the Chumash, actually, which talks about kingship. And you could say, there's something about the request that actually bothers me. And that is, give us a king like all the nations. But where's coming the idea that we have to be like all the nations? On the contrary, Sefer Devarim makes it obviously clear that we don't judge ourselves about the way other nations do things. We have our own standards, or should have our own standards. And, right and wrong isn't a function of what other people do. What do you mean, give us a king like the other nations? Now, it's true, it's formulated that way in Sefer Devarim. Maybe next time I'll talk about that. But that is problematic. But that doesn't seem to be what's bothering Samuel. What's bothering Shmuel is not when they said, give us a king like all the other nations. What bothers him is, they said, give us a king to judge us. That's what bothers him. It's not necessarily like the other nations. The very request for kingship for Shmuel is something very problematic. And he turns to God. And the question, of course, when you study the book of Shmuel, is what is God's response? Now, God's response is not limited to what it says in chapter 8. God's response has to be looked at in terms of the book in general. But the bottom line is what God says 3 times in this chapter. Shema b'kol ha'am, v'chol asher yomu elecha, v'otcha ma'asu, ki oti ma'asu mimloch alehem. God is upset with it. God says, listen, don't take it personal. It's not about you. It's about me. It's a rejection of me. What bothers God probably is more kechol hagoyim. My whole point is, we're not kechol hagoyim. I gave you a separate set of laws. I gave you all the mitzvot. We don't judge by the others. We judge by ourselves. We have our own standards. So but as far as, don't take it personal. God may be even consoling his beloved prophet. Don't take it personal, though. But the bottom line is, right? The bottom line is, Shema b'kol ha'am. Shema b'kol ha'am. Right. Then God continues and says to Shmuel, but you know what? If you keep reading in the chapter, they'll tell you what you should do. But warn them what the king might do. That's later on in the chapter. What pasuk is that? Verse number 9. V'ato Shema b'kol ha'am, once again. Shema b'kol ha'am, very important. Obey them. Right? And Shmuel says to the people, Shmuel tells the people what God has said. And Shmuel says in verse number, was it 10? Verse 11. This is what the king is going to do. Now, when you read what it says the king is going to do, the word that governs the next set of psukim is the word take. The king is going to take. He's going to take your children. He's going to take your properties. He's going to take your land. He's going to take everything to aggrandize himself. He'll take it, he'll take it, he'll take. At the end, you have very little left. You cry out to God, and God's not going to answer you. In other words, what Shmuel says to them is, he's telling them this is what the king's going to do, and he thinks that when he warns the people about what kings might do, Mishpat HaMelech, they'll say, you know what, we thought this over, and it's a bad idea. That's not what happens, though. After he's finished telling them about the taking and the taking and the taking, but in verse number, 19, they don't listen to Shmuel's voice. He has to listen to their voice. No, we're not listening. We want a king. We want to be like all the other nations. Right? Shmuel takes this back to God, and God says to Shmuel, Shema b'kolam. Once again, in verse number 23, it's very clear. God probably is unhappy with Kechol HaGoyim. I can demonstrate that. I'm not going to do that right now. But the bottom line is, if they want a king, give them a king. That's actually, it's very interesting that when you open up the Chumash to the book of Devarim, chapter 17, which talks about kingship, it only tells you what the king should not do. The king should not have too many horses. The king should not have too many wives. The king should not have too much money. The king should not take you down to Egypt. The king should write a Sefer Torah and actually read it, in order that the king be God-fearing and not be haughty. But what the Torah never says, actually, is what does the guy do for a living? What is the job of the king? It doesn't say. It says what a king should not do. When you come into the land and you say, we want a king like all the nations, God says you can have a king, one that God chooses and one that serves the people. In other words, you can have a king, but not like the other nations. King has to be subservient to God and play by God's rules, and the king has to understand that you serve the people. That's what the Chumash says. But it never says what the king does for a living. Here it says it, actually. The people said it. The king has two jobs. The king is some kind of a judge, Shvatanu Malkeinu, and the king is the commander-in-chief of the army. Here you actually have a description of what the king does. For Shmuel, though, obviously, he's trying to convince the people they should not have a king, and why? Because what he's concerned about is that the king will abuse power. When you give someone so much power, there will necessarily be abuse of power. And therefore, he says, he's trying to convince them not to change their mind, not to choose a king. God says to them, if they want a king, they can have a king. But that doesn't necessarily mean that God or the book dismisses Shmuel's concern. On the contrary, Shmuel's concerns are valid, but they're insufficient to disqualify the idea of kingship. The previous book said you need a king, because without a king you have anarchy. That's how the previous book ended. There's something to be said for having a king. And I want to make one final comment about choosing a king. The parasha of the king is chapter 17 of Sefer Devarim. And the Torah says, if you want to have a king, you can have a king. Not like the nations. You can have a king, one that God would choose, one that serves the people, etc. What is the positive side of kingship? What is the positive side of kingship? The text is in chapter 17 of Sefer Devarim, and I suggest the following: kingship as a positive. Because what Sefer Devarim is about, a remarkable book, totally different from the other books of the Torah. It's a different feel to it, different language to it, just totally different. But the idea of Sefer Devarim is setting up your own society. When you come into the land, you're going to set up your own society. It's not like in the desert where God travels with you in the Mishkan and God is at the center. In the book of Devarim, God's up in heaven someplace, and you visit 3 times a year. And you have God's temple, but God isn't even in the temple. God's name is in the temple, but God's not in the temple. God's far away. And you set up your own society, and you're going to have a whole system of judges. And the priests have a certain role, a small role actually, in Sefer Devarim. And you have the prophet in the book of Devarim. and you have the king, the Sefer Devarim, and you have the social network in Sefer Devarim. That's what it's about. The idea that you are creating your own society. It's the last step in. That's why the king can't take you back to Mitzrayim, because Mitzrayim is the place where you live on someone else's agenda. You were slaves. You couldn't make your choices. The goal of the Chumash is to create a society in which we take responsibility, and one that is not like Mitzrayim, one that doesn't mistreat the marginalized people, one that treats everybody fairly, with a sense of equity, a sense of compassion and concern. The Torah suggests it's kind of ideal society from the Torah standpoint, the ideal society, and that's the positive side of kingship. Is people take responsibility. The first king of Israel is named Shaul, the one who was requested. It's the people's request. There's something positive about it. Having said that, the Kachol HaGoyim is not positive, because the book of Devarim is dead set against that. They have their gods, they have their idolatries. You can't have that. It's not for you. They have the witchcraft, the sorcerers, the diviners. Tamim Teyem Hashem Elokecha. No, you operate a different way. They have their astrology. Ramban says, and maybe it even works for them. Maybe it works. It's not for you, that's all. So there is something problematic about the request. But the question is, why is Shmuel against it? And that we'll see next time, because Shmuel is going to be against it, but he's also going to choose the king. And the question next time that we'll deal with, given the time that we have, is what kind of kingship does Samuel actually set up? And that's what's interesting. The book has two kinds of kingship. The book has the kingship of Saul, and the book has the kingship of David. And they're not the same kingship. It's a very important point in the book, which is, when you think about it, it's obvious, but most people don't think about it. And that it's a different kind of kingship. And in the kingship of Saul, Samuel plays a very central role in the kingship, which is part of the problem. At the end of the day, it doesn't work. Kingship of David is a prophet also, Nathan the prophet. He has a different role. So we're going to be talking about the differences between Samuel the prophet in the court of Saul and Nathan the prophet in the court of David. And we'll have to stop at this point, as we, when you're studying the book of Shmuel, you could talk for hours on end here. There's no limit, actually. There's so much here. But we have to confine ourselves. Okay, so this is just by way of introduction. Next week, we'll talk about Samuel in the court of Saul. And then following that, Nathan, David, and Natan. Are there any last questions or comments here? Kayla?
Other new classes coming up include a new Masechet in Mishnah in Depth. Mishnah in Depth will pick up Horiot starting July 6th on Sundays at 1 p.m. You can find out more about all these classes at drisha.org/classes. Thank you everyone for joining, whether you're just joining for the afternoon or you're in the kollel full time. And I hope you have a good day.